So how do you feel about the word evangelism? I wanted us to work through the book of Jonah because it's really a story about someone who was called by God to go and fulfill God's mission, and he said no. And I think for all of us, amidst the challenges that we face, the life and death struggles, it's easier just to do nothing. And that's largely what Jonah tried to do. He tried to go to a place where he believed God was not. And so as we're looking at this story, be thinking of it in terms of your life and our merciful God's call to go and share the mercy we've received with others and even people that are hard to love. What do you think of the name Mark Driscoll? I know a lot of you guys are from a church background, and he was a significant pastor for a long time in the Seattle area. For a lot of people, his name is synonymous with controversy. And I know there's a lot of questions about, was his ministry here in Seattle a success, or was it a failure? And let me paint a little picture, because when I think about us starting a church, he started a church in downtown Seattle, which is considered the hardest place to plant a church in the Northwest. And over years, it grew to a church of about 14,000 people. That's a lot of people in a church. And they were over 15 locations in other states. I read that at one point there were about 300,000 sermon views every week. I mean, if you just look at that part of his life, you might, wow, that's really successful. And I think for a time, God really blessed and used his ministry. I know that I've been impacted by his teaching. And then there was a time when word got out that his elders confronted him on a sin pattern and brought it to his attention, and he declined to do anything and actually resigned. And then when he resigned, the church essentially dissolved. And so when I think of Mark Driscoll, he's this complicated servant of God, where there's been moments of his life that God used him in profound ways, and there's been real hurt that's been caused because of some of the things that were done or not done. And so when I think of him, some see him as an utter failure, some see him as a success. And I think for what we're looking at in the life of Jonah, it's similar in that we don't quite know, is Jonah a success or a failure? I mean, he was God's man. He was the prophet to speak for God. That was his job, one thing that he was supposed to do. And he didn't do his job, and he ran away. And so when I think of Jonah and I wonder, is he a success or a failure? I think what we can look at is an opportunity to learn from his life. And I think we learn from the life of Jonah that God transforms our failure into his success as we turn to him and trust his mercy for us. And it's the mercy that we've been given that he wants us to share with others. And so before we dig into this story, it's written in another time and place, and a couple of things just to highlight. I mentioned this last week, is this is a satirical story. And so I think I asked this last week, any SNL fans in the room? I don't know if you read the Bible with that idea, but that's the book of Jonah. There's a lot of humor in it, and it's ironic humor, where the man that's supposed to speak for God runs away, and then the people that he's supposed to reach him. I mean, and we're going to learn next week that even the cows repent. So it's a very humorous kind of story. And it's a story about a real and rebellious prophet who hates God for loving his enemies. And we see him in the Bible. He's a real person. In 2 Kings 14, he was just a short story of his life that he went to bless a king that was known for being horrible. And he believed that God was going to bless this horrible king. There's even a contrast in another prophet, Amos, is actually disagreeing with Jonah. So all I had to say is Jonah's this complicated figure. You don't know if you should trust him. And so as we're reading it, though, it's the one hardship that I face is I read this story and I just think, man, this guy's just a failure. And yet, Jesus in Luke 11 lifts him up and says that he's a faithful preaching prophet. And Jesus says he's an example for us. So I scratched my head just thinking, Jesus, what do you see in Jonah? And I think what Jesus sees in Jonah is what he sees in us. That he works through us. We all have complicated stories. We all have issues that we're dealing with. And like Mark Driscoll and like Jonah, who are complicated figures, we have complicated aspects of our life too. And yet Jesus chose Jonah, chose Mark, chose us to be his faithful witness. And so for us, that's why I want us to work through that book, the 21 questions or 21 days to increase our spiritual conversations, because I think for our church, we're about people that don't know God. And we're going to come together and we're going to become a family and we're going to become close as we love people that don't know him. And I want to make evangelism, I want to make spiritual conversations seem more normal, because they can be. It's as simple as Rich's story of saying hi to someone and just seeing where that goes. At age 15, Lois promised God that she'd live on mission for him. 15-year-old. It's crazy. That's Eloise's age, more or less. It's Michael's age. Are you 15? 13. Okay. You guys look older to me. But she married a man at age 23. So she gave this promise to God, like, I'm going to live on mission for you at age 15. 15 years of age. 23, she marries a guy who she finds out is a heavy drinker. And then finds out that resisted faith. And so as she married this person and kind of lived a life together, she believed that she'd never fulfill her promise. The good news of the story is that her husband, 60 years later, decided to follow Jesus. And before he died, really lived on fire for the Lord. And at age 76, Lois was reminded of her promise she made as a 15-year-old. And I thought it was interesting. She said, this is what her prayer to God. She said, Lord, I'm too old to go. I can't do this at 76. And that was her starting point. I can't do this. And it reminds me of Jonah. Like he said, I can't do this, God. And yet God was committed to Jonah. God was committed to Lois. She took a step, praying, trying to think of ways to really step into God's mission. And over 10 years, and this is an incredible part, there's a lot in between this, but she moved to the Philippines. And she started a small orphanage that cared for 35 kids. And they loved this woman so much that they would call her Lula, which is grandma. And I love that, to hear this story of transformation, not only in the life of Lois and her husband, but God didn't give up on Lois and her promise. And God reminded her at that stage that was the right time, because it was a time that she stepped forward to really enter into God's mission. And she fulfilled her promise. And I love that, because Lois and Jonah remind me it's never too late. It's never too late to turn towards God's purpose. And that's what we're going to see with Jonah, is his turning towards God's purpose, when for a lot of people they might see like it was too late. And for those that missed last week, Jonah ran from God, got on a boat. God brought a storm to get his attention. The sailors turned to God, and Jonah just says, I give up. I'm going to give my hands into God's hand. And they threw him out into the sea. And the sea was kind of known at that time as being symbolic for chaos. And so the sailors are like, oh, this guy's gone. So if you're a reader reading this back then, you'd be like, Jonah's gone. And so now we pick up the story that Jonah's not gone. And so let's look at verse 17. It said, the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah. And this is an important part. He was in the belly 3 days and 3 nights. 3 days, 3 nights. So God transforms our failure into success by first getting our attention. That's what he wants to do. If we're going to be transformed from failure to success, God's going to first get our attention. And that's what he does with Jonah. The story shifts from the storm to the fish. And for the reader, they're uncertain what to make of it all. Back then, a large fish was kind of this monster, and kind of remind them of chaos. And God's definitely doing something unexpected, using this fish to swallow Jonah. But yet for Jonah, all he knows is he's in a dark place. Like, put yourself into his situation. He's thrown overboard, and it's dark, and he's going unconscious, and I don't know what he's thinking. He's probably thinking really sad thoughts at this point. And then the next thing he knows is that he's still alive, and it's dark, but it's slightly less wet. And he doesn't understand what's going on. And in his sovereignty, God appoints this fish. So this was God's fish, which is part of the humor in it, right? He has a man that doesn't do what he wants, but so he goes to this fish to get this man's attention. And this fish represents chaos. And so for the reader, they're wondering, like, okay, he's eating Jonah. This is judgment. Like, that's what the reader's thinking. This is God's judgment. And then we read the important phrase, 3 nights and 3 days, which says that Jonah's alive. He's not dead. He's facing death, but he's not yet dead. And that's what the fish is for Jonah. It's just to get Jonah's attention through this really this difficult moment in his life. He needs to relearn how Jonah's world is under God's control. And so for the sailors, they already learned this. They learned this when the storm came out. They moved from being kind of assuming there's lots of gods to vowing to serve the only God. And during that, what was Jonah doing? He was sleeping. And he wasn't just sleeping, he was resistant. He didn't want to be a part of that. The pagan captain had to find him. He was like, are you crazy? Like, what are you doing? You're sleeping. Now, for a Jew, their theology was grounded in God's sovereignty. So you didn't have to tell a Jew God is sovereign. Like in Deuteronomy, when it says he's the only God, there's one God. Like, that's to say God's sovereign. So throughout the Old Testament, it's woven through everything. You don't have to say that God's sovereign. Yahweh was the only God. Yet for Jonah, it was still kind of head knowledge. It wasn't something in his heart. And he needed this experience to relearn how God was in charge. There's a story of a pastor of a large church. I read this and it caught my attention because he was having fruitful ministry. Church was growing. Everything looked great on the outside. But on the inside, his relationship with God was not in a good spot. And he got depressed to a point where he didn't tell anyone. He just ran. He ran away. And I don't know why, but he ran to like the middle of Canada. I mean, Canada is like great, nice people. I'm from Minnesota, so like our brothers and sisters in Canada, nice people. I don't know why he went to Canada, but he went to start a new career as a logger. Left his family, left his kids, left his church. And one night it was 20 below, and his heater stopped working, and that's when it the switch was turned for him. And with all this unresolved bitterness, he started to yell out, like, "I hate you, God! I hate you, God!" I wonder what people were thinking, like, it's just a heater, like, what's going on with this guy? He's like, "Get out of my life." And with heavy tears and deep breathing, this voice that he retells was really clear, and it was in his mind, and he just heard, like, I'm with you. I love you. And that just broke him. That's when he met Jesus in a new way, and God got his attention. And so he got in his car, drove back to his family, and worked through a really difficult transition back to change, make new habits. But as he did that, God was really faithful through that process, and now actually the church is in a better place, and his family's in a better place. God uses the world's confusion to get our attention, to help us get off ourselves to him. And the Bible says that God is slow to anger, abounding in love. We're going to see that in chapter 4, which is kind of the culmination of Jonah's life. God reveals himself yet again. I'm slow to anger, abounding in love. Which means that this chaos exists because God is patient with us. He's patient with us. We see the difficulty in our world not because God, he can't do something. That's not why it's still there. He chooses to allow it to continue because he's patient towards us. God could start over. He could start over. He's done that before with Noah. He could start over. But he chooses to see what's going to happen in our life to see if we're going to turn to him or not. He created us. He loves us. He wants us to turn to him. a problem is that we don't realize that we broke the world he loves. We blame God for the chaos in our world, but the problem started with us and our lineage back to Adam, who chose self, not God. And so we are learning that we can't fix the world's problems. And we keep relearning this lesson. And yet God keeps being faithful and committed. And he doesn't start over. He forgives us. He gives us a second chance if we turn to him. And so amidst the chaos and frustrations, our dark places, these are God's ways to get our attention. And so what chaos in life is getting your attention? What's the hardest thing you're facing right now? Now let's go deeper into this story and hear from Jonah's heart as he prays to God from this dark place. And so verses 2-6, I'm just going to kind of summarize. He says, Jonah, and this is so key, you can underline it. Jonah prayed in. He prayed in the dark place. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. For you cast me into the deep. And then verse 4, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. Verse 6, I went down, yet you brought me up into life. That phrase is so important. I went down, but God brought him up. So God transforms our failure into his success when he gets our attention. And then the second thing is when we turn to him in our greatest need. When we turn to him in our greatest need. That's where Jonah's at. This poem is a psalm, and it gives us a unique emotional perspective within Jonah's mind. And if you are kind of wanting to break this in to more digestible parts, verse 2, you could kind of bracket that. That's kind of the intro. Verses 3-6 is the problem. So you kind of like circle that part. And then 7-10 is the solution. So there's intro, verse 2, problem, 3-6, solution, 7-10. And so in the intro and the problem, it starts with in my distress. This is interesting. So there's a baby shower on Saturday. The word distress is actually the same word that's used for a mom who's pregnant. And the idea is you feel bound up and needing a change to be like released from the discomforts, which you're almost there. So that's the idea that's being described of Jonah. He's kind of in this womb, and he wants to get out. And so he's trapped in this dark place, and here's the key, it's getting worse. So it's not just that it's bad, it's getting worse. And you see that in the story in chapter 1. You can follow it. He goes down to Joppa, so he goes down. He goes down in a ship. He goes down into sleep. He goes down in the ocean, and now where is he? He's like down in a fish. So his life is going downward. That's the trajectory. And so his pain isn't just hard, it's hellish. And that's because he's growing to a point where the phrase depths of the grave, which means that he's as good as dead. So he's in the worst place possible. I think about when I was with my mom, and I thought, I was 21, I had life figured out as a 21-year-old, and I thought, I'll take her into the Boundary Water canoe area, and we'll go explore. My mom can't swim. I didn't really understand what I was doing. It was not a good pair. And we got out pretty deep, and then the storm came in really quick. And I still remember being on this island with a thunderstorm. If you've ever been in a thunderstorm in the Midwest, it's scary. And it was right over us, the lightning, the thunder. It was getting dark. I mean, it was just like this. Dark. It was like getting dark, but a lot of rain, and we were just soaked. I didn't have anything to protect us. And all my mom is doing is praying. And my mom, and she prays for parking spots, and she gets them. It's so annoying. But she really believes in prayer, and I believe in prayer because of my mom. And I'll never forget, we went for it, and long story long, I'm not kidding, we went past this isthmus and out into a new lake through these waves, and it was like glass. And it was just like this moment where I was like, okay, there is a God. Like, this is crazy. And so for those moments when we're stuck and trapped, it's a reminder that God used that to get our attention to lead to life change. So he's not just wanting to get our attention. He wants things to change. And he wants it to change by us turning to him. And so this is Jonah's turning point. He's out of options. And we see that in verse 4. I'm driven away from God, yet I shall look to his presence. So if you remember in chapter 1, he's leaving God's presence, and now he's looking to God's presence. He chose God. And so he can't change his circumstances. He's still in a fish. Maybe he figured that out by now. And there is regret. He says that he was driven away from God, so there's this regret that he knows that he left his place with God. He feels remorse. And he can't change that, but he can turn towards God. His mind, his heart, he can turn towards God. And so Jonah is now going beyond just knowing God is sovereign to really choosing God, like trusting him, turning to God with his greatest need. There's an MIT professor I was reading about, and it was interesting hearing her story. She didn't need religion. I find it interesting when that's people's starting point. They decide they don't need religion. And out of curiosity, she opened the Bible, and she felt spoken to. And then a pastor got in the mix, which that's when real problems happen for people that don't need religion. It's like he asked, like, who is the Lord of your life? Who's the Lord of your life? And that's when she realized that it's me. And her words were, I'm the captain of my own ship. And so she realized I need help. And the reason she knew that she needed help is through these conversations with this pastor. This is what she said. She said, I work closely with people filled with struggles, and I realized I didn't have the answer to explain suffering. So she knew that she didn't have all the answers. But now I know there's a God of greatness and love who enters into the suffering with us. I think that's what's so unique about our God, is that he doesn't sit back and wait for us to figure it out. Like, he did the work. He entered in. And so we just got to trust him. We just got to turn to him. And so God's in control of the situation for Jonah. Jonah's life is about to end, but God's in control. And what I love is this MIT professor says, today I walk with joy alongside the greatest companion. She said, I don't have all the answers, but I like exploring this world with him. And I think that's the mindset, is believing God's in control. We don't have all the answers, but we know that he's with us. And for us, our chaos creates an opportunity for a fresh start. It's not to punish, it's to get our attention. We talked last week that, sometimes God uses pain to get our attention. Kind of like when a kid touches a stove, we let them because we know that it'll hurt, but they'll be okay. They'll learn. That's what God's doing in this situation. I'm not saying every suffering is that. We know that in this situation because that's what the author's telling us. And so there's moments in our suffering that could be God's way of reminding us to turn back to him. Some suffering is just a consequence of sin, so not all suffering is the same. I'm not saying that. In Jonah's experience, it's a result of God, of him turning from God, and God wants to get his attention. And so for Jonah and for some of us, when we want to preserve ourselves, we turn inward. And that's where sometimes when we're facing suffering, when we turn inward, it just gets really isolated and it gets us in a dark place. And so the solution is, in our distress, call outward. That's what Jonah does. So hard. So easy for me to say that here, but so hard to do. In your distress, to turn outward to God. Like, that's what Jonah's reminding us. Very difficult to do. Easy to preach, hard to do. But that's what Jonah reminds us. Because we have a companion. God hears us. And he wants to meet us where we're at. And so where is God in your chaos? In this difficulty you're in, where is God? And how are you turning to him? It could be just being here tonight. It could be that's how you're turning to God. It could be that you just give a short prayer. I remember when Lagayo and we were at our real difficult moment, just having, like, I need you, God. Short prayers. God hears them. We don't need to pray lengthy prayers. Just, God, I need you. God hears that. He's going to meet us. Are you turning towards him? Now, as Jonah turns to God, we see how he's going to find a solution from his dark place. So that's where I want to close in our time. In verses 7 through 10, it says, when my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I have vowed. Salvation belongs to God. And so God transforms our failure into his success when he gets our attention, when we turn towards him, and then when we trust his mercy. That's the last part. When we trust in God's mercy, that's what Jonah's doing. He recognized how bad his situation was at this point. It's not only that he needs help, he needs salvation, and there's a big difference. When you're out of options, I mean, you're desperate for what's going to help you, and that's where Jonah's at. Now, at this life or death moment, he trusts in God. He remembers God's faithfulness. I think for the reader, we see God through this whole thing, like God caused the storm, God sent the sailors, God appoints the fish. Like we see God throughout. Jonah doesn't. He's so inward, he can't see God. And that's what I think we can learn from Jonah is when we get when we're in pain, we turn inward, we miss out what God's doing. And so he was close to death, and it's in that moment that he was close to death that he remembered God. I remembered the Lord. He remembered his authority. He remembered his presence. And not only that, but think, Jonah's in rebellion. So he's remembering God in the midst of his conflict in his own soul to turn to God and remember who God is. God didn't give up on him, and he knew that. That's what he remembered. He remembered God doesn't give up on him. God was merciful to him. So we must trust God's mercy. It's not just turn to God, it's trusting his mercy. And that's what Jonah needed to learn, is does he trust God's mercy? Because before we can go and fulfill his mission, the mercy that we offer others has to be real to us. That's what we learn in chapter 2. Jonah deserved death. He didn't deserve deliverance. And yet God saved him. And Jonah remembered that and trusted his mercy. And you see it because the result is gratitude. Jonah realized he's not entitled to life. He just needed to trust God who gives and takes away. He believed God was sovereign, and in this moment God was merciful to him, and he trusted him, and he was grateful. I think about last month in our home, I told some of you guys it felt like a country western song, like our heater broke, our car broke, our dishwasher broke, some other stuff broke. I was like, what in the world? IRS is coming after us. It's like, awesome. It's great few weeks. No, we don't have a dog for that reason. But God was faithful in all of those. And this is the thing is, many things broke and I got frustrated. I had this did not deserve this moment. I really did. I was like, I don't deserve this. And God reminded me that we shouldn't even have a home to break. And that's real for us because in 2008, if you remember the financial situation, we owed a ton of money. And someone out of the blue came to us and said, hey, I hear that you have a condo, I have a house. What if we helped you out? And so it's a true miracle that we're in this home. And I'm so focused on these things breaking, I forget that. And that's when God reminded me, like, you're not grateful. Like, look what I gave you. And I feel like when we're not grateful, we don't share what's important to us. And I think that's what God's cultivating, is he wants Jonah to realize the mercy he has so that he's grateful. Grateful people talk about what they're thankful for. And so that's what he's trying to do with Jonah. And so God's mercy towards us must result in gratitude and trust, because that's what's going to cause us to share his mercy with the world. We don't need a fish story to remind us that every breath is a gift. We don't. We just need to take a moment and reflect, like, this life we have is a gift. The problem is that we think we've earned the life that we have. That's the issue. And we feel entitled to be angry. But in God's mercy, we're here. And the only appropriate response is to say thank you. So what are you giving thanks to God for today? What are you grateful for? It could be even a house that's breaking, right? Even in the heart of life, there's good. What are you thankful for? Now, before I close, there's one verse that might catch you off guard, and that's verse 17. What does it say? The fish vomited him up. Now, that's kind of funny, right? Like, fish vomited him up. This is I want to highlight this before we go into time of prayer. Why does he vomit? He could have said anything. Delivered, any other word. He says vomit. If you're back then reading this, vomit, that idea had this idea of judgment. So now I'm really confused. Like, what's going on? Like, Jonah's very contrite and he's promising to do things. And that's the thing. At this moment in his life, he's still all talk. And so God, vomits him up because he's all talk, no action. In his confession, he casts judgment on these pagan sailors who are vowing to God, who are sacrificing to God. So if you remember the last chapter, this is the twist in the story. It's like everything's going to like nice, tidy bow, and then the vomit. And you're like, what are you doing, God? And that's because he wants to cause us, as we're reading this, to realize, is our prayer genuine? And the way we'll know it's genuine is what's going to happen in chapter 4. And so that's what will be, or chapter 3 and 4. So that's what will be for next week. But there's this twist in the story to cause us pause to say, are we just praying this, or are we going to live it out? And so as we take this time to pray that we live in response to God's mercy, that we're truly grateful. Like, give him thanks for the goodness in your life. And if you feel led to change tonight, follow through with your action. Don't make it just talk in this moment. Like, really resonate, God, what is the one thing you want me to do different? Because God transforms our failure into his success as we turn to him and trust his mercy. A mercy he wants us to digest and make our own so that we share it with the world. And so we're going to take a time of prayer together as a church. Anne's going to come up. For those online, we're going to transition from streaming to go on Zoom. And Erica's online, and she's going to facilitate a time of prayer with Lucy and I think Sam in the room with Zoom. And so if you guys want to move your way over, if you don't know how to do that, you can text me. We'll figure this out in the future in a better way. But for now, this is my number. You guys can all have my number. It's 206-383-2875. So 206-383-2875. Text me. We'll get you on the Zoom call. But for the rest of us, Anne's going to come up and lead us in a time of